Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to Dream Scenarios. This is the 16th episode in which we're investigating dreams and the meanings that are attached to them. And the truth is that, at least on the surface, the beginning of the Gemara we're going to learn tonight is not about dreams. It's about a different method of communication, or like messages coming from a higher place. However, as we will see, if you learn this Gemara properly, I would like to tell you that that opening piece of the Gemara is also about dreams, as you will see. So, it looks like we have a statement or a teaching from the Talmud which is not dream related, and then we go back to dream scenarios, and the novelty of today's class is that all four are dream scenarios. If that makes no sense to you, okay, keep on watching. And you will see how it all comes together. We are on Daf Nun Hey, Amud Beis, very close to the bottom, or almost at a page turner class, or a page moving class, onto Daf Nun Vav. And at least on the surface, what we're going to begin with sounds almost like tangential, doesn't it? It doesn't follow the trajectory of what we've been learning. So we've been learning that dreams require interpretations, and that verbally articulated interpretation can make all the difference. And we had a story with an elder who went to Jerusalem, even though that's not really where he was from, and there were 24 different dream interpreters, and we talked about what makes a person a dream interpreter. And they all gave interpretations, verbalized, articulated, and spoke about their interpretations, and everything came true. And the Gemara says from this we can make an observation that dream articulation or interpretation that's articulated is very powerful. And we talked a lot about that. And now the Gemara begins to say something which has nothing to do on the surface, it seems, with dreams. But I think that it's, there are multiple ways of learning Pshat in this Gemara. But as you're going to see, I think that if we think this through carefully, this is also about dreams. So let's learn at first the well-worn way, the way which ignores the fact that it might be talking about dreams. Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Yechanan said, we're like 6 lines from the bottom, a teaching from Rabbi Yechanan. And the teaching from Rabbi Yechanan is, Hishkim, a person rises, v'nafal loi pasuk l'toich piv, and a verse falls for him into his mouth. I'm translating that literally. Nafal loy, lamed vav, falls for him, l'toich piv, into his mouth. Harezu nevuah ketana. This is a minor prophecy. So, sounds like this has nothing to do with dreams. It sounds like if a verse falls into somebody's mouth, then it's like a minor prophecy. So question 1, what does it have to do with the cadence of the Gemara? Because the Gemara talks about dreams before, and the Gemara talks about dreams afterwards. That's question number 1. Question number 2, what exactly does that mean when we say it's a nevuah ketana? What is a minor prophecy? What's the difference in a big prophecy and a little prophecy? It's like being a little bit pregnant. What does it mean? It's a prophecy or it's not a prophecy? I'll ask you another question. My other question is, why hishkim? Why only when a person woke up? What if a verse hits you out of nowhere? Is it a prophecy then too? What does it have to do with waking up? And finally, how does it fit into the business of dreams and verbalization and interpretation? So the whole thing is like very, very strange. Oh, this is my final question. My final question, this you can't know from just looking at the Gemara, but I'm telling you that in less than 2 pages from now, the Gemara repeats this exact same teaching. So if you're going to say, well, the reason that we had to put this teaching in, it really has nothing to do with anything, or it doesn't fit anywhere specific, but that's the nature of the Talmud. We just throw in since we're going to talk about Rabbi Yechanan, we're going to tell over some teachings of Rabbi Yechanan, and since Rabbi Yechanan's name has been mentioned before, so we threw in another teaching of Rabbi Yechanan. So you don't have to turn many pages. You just have to turn to Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Go to the very, very first page of 57b, like A1, like right in the beginning, the top line. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Hishkim, go to 57b, the first line. Hishkim, a person rises, v'nafal pasach l'teich piv, and a verse falls into his mouth, harei zeh nevuah ktana. So this final question, which you couldn't have known if I didn't point it out to you, exacerbates all of the above questions. Because even if we were to say that sometimes the Gemara will include something that doesn't fit into the specific cadence because there was no better place to include it, well, why does the Gemara repeat it? Yes, the Gemara does sometimes have multiple records of the same teaching in different tractates, or sometimes 60 or 70 pages away from each other, but a page and a half away? Literally? What's the point? And the strangest thing is that Rashi comments on page 57b, and he says nothing on page 55b on the bottom. Nothing. Doesn't say a word. Wouldn't you think that if Rashi was coming to explain the Gemara, he should have explained it the first time around? Especially if it's the same Gemara. What does Rashi say? Rashi says that the word hishkim, the word rising, which that's the way I would typically translate the word, to rise in the morning. He said hishkim means ha'omed mimitato, the person who rises or gets up from his bed. And then at the moment when he or she is getting up from their bed, v'nafal loy pasuk bifiv, and then a verse falls into their mouth. So Rashi he chooses to comment on the words hishkim, which typically means one rises, and he says it means one gets up or out of bed. So the first time we have the word of hishkim, Avraham Avinu gets up in the morning. It says vayashkem Avraham babayker. Avraham wakes up early in the morning. Okay? Beseder, Avraham Avinu wakes up early in the morning. Doesn't say he got out of bed. It's self-understood, he got out of bed. Most people, if you wake up, if you're an early riser, you're probably getting out of bed. To wake up early in the morning, yawn and go back to sleep is not called waking up early in the morning. That's called turning over. So why does Rashi even have to say this? Very strange. Be'emet, very strange. Now the Sifsei Chachamim, in his commentary, he says, what is the meaning of a verse falling in? Oh, Yitzi, very good Yitzi. Yitzi from California is pointing out that the Gemara on Daf Nun Hey says nafal loy, fell to him. The Gemara on Daf Nun Zayin on page 57 says nafal. Very good Yitzi. So this diok is made by the Yismach Moshe. Yismach Moshe makes this precise analysis, so you're on the money. And you'll see the Yismach Moshe has a beautiful way of explaining this, which follows also the words of the Tzlach. We'll see, but that's a very good diuk. But before we get to the difference between nafal loy, falling to him, or nafal l'teich piv, what is the meaning of l'teich piv? What does that mean? Words fell onto his tongue. What is we adding when we say words fell onto his tongue? So the Sifsei Chachamim says, Mairi shahoitzi mi piv dafke. This is not a verse that came to mind. This is a verse that came to mouth. Came to mouth means you said it. You said it. Came to mind doesn't mean came to mouth. So it's not thinking of a verse, it's saying the verse. This is very important. Lo sha'ala b'machshavte. It didn't just come to mind. Now, if you take a look at the Sifsei Chachamim a little bit later, in his commentary on Rashi that says, the Sifsei Chachamim says like this. When Rashi comments on page 57, and he says that Hishkim means ha'imedu mitosei v'nofaloi pasuk, a verse falls to him. So he says, Ritzoni loimar, kol odom ha'omed mimita. So what Rashi means to say is any person who gets out of his bed, af shalo chalam lo klum, even though he had no dream. So even though he had no dream, if you get out of bed and all of a sudden you find yourself mouthing a verse of the Torah or of the Tanakh, of the Nevi'im Uksuvim, oh, this is a sign. This is a sign. That's a Nevuah Ketana. And he, in saying this, the Sifsei Chachamim is quoting an earlier, one of the commentaries, whose name is the Smichas Chachamim. So, I'm going to get into this more when I share with you the words of Tzlach, but I want to just make a suggestion right now. And I'm going to buttress the suggestion. Right? The suggestion I want to make to you is that the difference between our Gemara, the Gemara on Daf Nun Hey, on page 55b at the very end, and the Gemara that's a page and a half away, on the very top of 57, side B, the top line, the difference is that Rabbi Yochanan's teaching is cited twice. The first time, it's waking up in the morning, following a dream and saying something. The second time, it's waking up in the morning and finding yourself mouthing a verse. The first time is talking about following a dream. The second time is not talking about following a dream. L'cha'ira, it seems that the Sifsei Chachamim is learning the Pshat. He's explaining Rashi. He says the first time Rashi doesn't say anything because it's self-understood we're talking about a person who woke up. And because the cadence of the Gemara here is talking about detail after detail, teaching after teaching of dreams and dream interpretation, so it's self-understood. The person woke up in the morning and he finds himself mouthing a verse. It's not just waking up in the morning and having a verse. The novelty of the Gemara on Daf Nun Zayin is that even if a person didn't have a dream, but his first thought in the morning, that's really the key. The first thought, like there was a question I asked you, what's the difference between the morning and later? Because that first thought when your mind is absolutely empty, the first thought that comes in, that could be something meaningful also. It's a very good question. It's a very good question, Chava. So, l'cha'ira, you're now allowed to say words of Torah before you wash your hands. So, what is it? I was trying to imagine to myself, how does this work? Does it mean when a person gets up in his undergarments and he has just washed Negelwasser? Or does it mean like a little bit after that, when a person could already mouth something? So this is like this is I'm just introducing you. This is where we're going. Okay. So in other words, the suggestion that we're going to have to make over here is, I know it sounds very simple, but it took me a long time to figure this out. I'm not so smart. I had to go over this again and again and again. So like, aha, that's what's going on over here. So this is a dream. This chaser. This follows a dream. Okay. So let me explain things a little bit more. I want you to know that not everybody agrees with what I'm saying. There are some of the Mefarshim who learn Pshat that there's no inherent difference between the Gemara on page 57 and the Gemara on page 55. But I'm also not making this up. So the Yigiyas Mardechai says like this. He says that the only way to understand the difference, Rashi only comments a second time, and why the Gemara is repeating its teaching a page and a half apart, is that they're two separate teachings, actually, he says. And he says that it follows this specific story of the Gemara, narrative after narrative after narrative of dreams, is because that Af Maimer Zeh, and I'm quoting, Af Maimer Zeh Medubar b'mishara b'chaleimei davar shetzarich pisrei. He said, this is also talking about something that needs interpretation. This also needs interpretation. A person woke up in the morning, he had this dream, it's very real, it's very vivid, it's bothering him, he needs to have it interpreted. And when he woke up in the morning, and he was thinking, what could this dream possibly mean? And suddenly he found himself mouthing a verse from the Tanakh. He suddenly found himself saying something which is biblical. He's paraphrasing scripture. So the Igias Mordechai says, that's a sign that you're getting the interpretation to your dream in a manner of Nevuah Ketana. And what's the difference? We'll talk about what a Nevuah Ketana is, but what's the difference in a manner of Nevuah Ketana? He said Rav Bano had many interpretations for his dream. And all of them happened. So we had the discussion on the previous episode. How does that work? I mean, which one was right? And one of the beautiful explanations is that he had a dream with like 24 different little episodes. It's like one long story. And different interpreters seemed to zero in on a different detail. And in the end, he ended up with 24 different interpretations, being 24 different things that were being conveyed to him during the course of a single dream. So they all came true. But we also talked about this concept where there could be multiple interpretations. You can interpret it in one way or interpret it the other way. And therefore the Igias Mordechai says, this teaching is telling us that in as much as dreams that are interpreted by dream interpreters, or those who are prone to interpret dreams and verbalize the meaning of dreams, and in doing so to bring forth some kind of actualization, a realization of what the dream is about, he says ultimately when we see a person who wakes up in the morning, bothered by a dream, is yearning, looking, seeking interpretation, and suddenly finds himself mouthing the words of Scripture, that's a Nevuah Ketana. That's his interpretation. And the meaning of Nevuah Ketana means that you don't need to seek any further interpretation. This is ironclad. This is a message, not only your dream is coming from a higher place, your interpretation is coming from a higher place also. All of it's coming from a higher place. So that's why it fits into the continuation of these narratives. Why? Because we said that kol hachalomot holchen acher hapeh. All of the chalomot, all the dreams, they follow verbal interpretation. Whose words? Could be somebody else's. Rav Yochanan's novelty is, could be your own. Could be your words. And that's the point of nafal loy l'toich piv. The idea came to him, but it fell into his mouth, so to speak. He found himself mindlessly mentioning this verse. And the fact that he found himself mentioning the verse, articulating the verse, speaking, saying, talking, and he's basically saying saying something about the dream because he was looking for an interpretation, that becomes the articulated interpretation in the most ironclad way. And he says the point here would be that it all is hoilach achar hapeh, and the best mouth of all would be your own mouth when it comes in a mindless way. So the Tzlach seems to say something very similar. The Tzlach says like this. The Tzlach, in later on in the Gemara Daf Nun Zayin, the Tzlach mentions that this is talked about earlier, and he says, Lo yadati tam al hishonas hadavar kan. I don't understand why this is being repeated. Why? We just learned this a page and a half ago. And he gives a possible answer, but he's not really happy with his answer, like a nuance. Yochanan's responding to somebody here. And then he says, I'm even more bothered. And I was very happy to see that the same question I had the question of the Tzlach. He says, Yeshet me'ani al Rashi. Rashi here says, Hishkim ha'oimid b'mitosei. Rising means getting out of bed, which is chidush davar. There's a novelty to that, because rising just means to wake up. And Rashi later on says it means getting out of bed. Well, if that's what it means, if Rashi's taking the word Hishkim out of its natural understanding, its organic meaning, why wouldn't he say it the first time? Why didn't Rashi say that to us the first time we mentioned the words of Rabbi Yochanan? Why does he only wake up now on page 57? So the Tzlach quotes the Smichas Chachamim also. He says the Smichas Chachamim has a whole bunch of questions about this, about the way in which is being learned. And the Smichas Chacham wants to say that later on in the Gemara, it's talking about somebody who woke up in the morning and found himself mouthing a verse, a phrase of Scripture, without being preceded by a dream. But here it is being preceded by a dream. So even though there are some of the Mefarshim who argue, we have the Tzlach on our side, and we have the Smichas Chachamim, and the Sif Chacham seems to agree with him. So I think this is exactly like the Pshat. And as I mentioned to you, the Yismach Moshe actually zeroes in on the words of Nafal Loi. He says the first time on Daf and Arb Gemara it says that Rabbi Yechanan said that he woke up in the morning. The Nafal Loi, it fell to him a pasuk l'teich piv. Fell to him means it comes on the heels of his dream. He had a dream, and now it fell into his mouth. Now he finds himself verbalizing that. Whereas the second time, there was no Nafal Loi, it only fell into his mouth. It didn't really come into his consciousness even. He wasn't even thinking about anything, and he finds himself all of a sudden mindlessly mouthing a verse. So that could be a Nevuah Ktana. Incidentally, the Maharsha, in his commentary later on in the Gemara, talks about the Nevuah Ktana element, and he says, what does it mean it's a Nevuah Ktana? What does Ataka mean? And he says that this could be similar to an idea which is mentioned in the Gemara in Chagiga, it's mentioned in the Gemara in Megillah, where they said to children, Psoik li psukecha. The most famous example of this is Mordechai, when he meets two children, and he says, tell me, so what you learn today? What's your pasuk? What's your verse? Psoik li psukecha. And the boy said to Mordechai, we learned, Al tiro mipachat pisa m'masheres l'shoim kisove. Don't be afraid of sudden terror, and don't be afraid of the wicked. And Mordechai said, okay, good. That's what I needed to hear. So we're going to be fine. So that's a Nevuah Ktana. So the Maharsha says that here, when a verse comes to you from somebody else, from a child, or when a verse comes to you on your own, first thing in the morning, a verse just comes to you out of nowhere, that's like a Nevuah Ktana. That's like a minor prophecy. But he says, he doesn't really say this, but I'm just saying, Maharsha comments on this later on. That's when he says, that's when he makes that draws that parallel between the children on page 57. But in our Gemara, the Maharsha doesn't say anything at all. So Yitzi is asking if I mean to say then that these are two separate sayings of Rabbi Yechanan, or it's being repeated for different lessons, so to speak. It's a really good question, Yitzi, and I don't know the answer. I don't know if Rabbi Yechanan said his teaching twice, or if the students of Rabbi Yechanan understood that his teaching could be applied twice. Could be either or. Could be Rabbi Yechanan said the teaching twice, and we see that the difference is in one word. The first time he said nafal loy, and the second one he said just nafal. It's eminently possible Rabbi Yechanan repeated a similar teaching a second time. Mechel David wants to know how seriously you should take the words of children. If it's inspiring and uplifting, take it seriously. Don't make decisions, life-altering decisions based on things like that. Incidentally, Mechel David, I think if my memory doesn't fail me, this is in the Smak. In the Sefer Mitzvahs Kotten, he has a whole discussion about whether a person is even allowed to do this. And he brings down Eliezer Eved Avram, and he brings down Mordechai. You can't just, we generally don't play these games. There's a methodology of how we come to conclusions when we have questions in life. And the simplest answer is, Aseh Lecha Rav. You have to have a spiritual mentor, and you ask your Rav, and you don't play games. That's not the way to... That's not, Sometimes Hashem will show you a sign. Invariably, it's Hashgacha Pratis. People have seen signs in life before. But it's not a strategy. You can't decide, okay, I'm going to, leave this to something random, and that's an answer. I once had a fellow who, he called me from overseas. I said, I'm watching your classes. I want to ask you a few questions. Okay, so he asked me a few questions. So I answered it to the best of my ability. And then he called me a second time and a third time. Okay, so the person asked, I tried to answer. And then he asked me a certain question, and I said, it says clearly you shouldn't do this. He says, no, but I think this is the right thing to do. I said, there's no way you're wasting my time. Then don't ask me. It wasn't like a halacha thing, it was a nuanced thing, and something with instructions that the Rebbe had given with regard to outreach. And I said to him, the Rebbe clearly writes not to do this, so you shouldn't do it. So he said to me, I go to the Ohel, and I write my letter, and then I look in all the torn up letters, and I look for a word, and whatever the word I find, that's my answer. I'm like, forgive me, who told you that that's right? Well, that's what I decided. I said, you have your own religion, you do your own thing. That's not what the Rebbe said. You decided, you decided, that's how you find your answers. The Rebbe said, Aseh Lecha Rav. The Rebbe said, have a mashpia, ask a shayla like you used to ask. Now you're asking yourself, and you want me to back it up? I said, don't call me anymore. Leave me alone. Like, it's just, you do your own thing. You're on your own. But I said, for the record, in my humble opinion, what you're doing is absolutely wrong. Not just incorrect, wrong, straight up wrong. I said, because you can decide how to interpret things, you can go against something explicit, an explicit instruction. We don't have the right to do that. This is not our game to make up the rules as we go along. We follow the rules. The game of life is played by the rules, and the rule book is the Torah, and the Chachamim, the sages who taught the Torah, and that's the rules we follow. Anyway, so the point here then is that we shouldn't necessarily look for things like this, and that leads us into, so what does a nevuah katana mean? What does nevuah katana mean anyway? And the Gemara here also uses that word. The Gemara says, Hareizu nevuah katana. So firstly, according to the Yigiras Mordechai, and maybe also according to the Tzlach, the nevuah katana could mean that you're getting an interpretation which is ironclad. It's an ironclad interpretation. You don't have to look for other interpretations. You have a clear interpretation to your dream. You're looking for a pitaron, you're looking for an interpretation, you got it. And it's a stronger interpretation that might come from somebody else who would interpret the dream. If it comes through your own mouth in a mindless way, then that's going to be the most powerful thing for you. Okay, that's one way of understanding this. And I think that's an accurate way to understand it. It's interesting to me that the Sifsei Chachamim, it's very interesting to me. He doesn't comment on the idea of a nevuah katana really. Later on, he speaks about a nevuah katana the first time. So in other words, like he establishes the pshat here, and he says something which I don't fully understand, and I'll tell you why I don't understand it. He says maybe it means that something small will be fulfilled, not in entirety. Something small will be fulfilled. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around this, because the Rambam clearly speaks about it in the laws of Yesodei HaTorah about the difference between people who are clairvoyant or soothsayers and a nevuah. He says there are people who seem to be able to foretell futuristic events. So what's the difference between them and a prophet? And he says the difference is this: the people who can see into the future can see things in an unclear way. And they don't know exactly what they're seeing, and they don't know exactly what they're talking about. They can tell you things. Some of it will be right, some of it will be wrong. It's not going to be clear. He says a prophet sees things with absolute clarity. And so, the Sifsei Chachamim's interpretation of the nevuah katana here seems a little bit almost like similar to a soothsaying thing. You're just saying things, but maybe something will come true. So what does that mean that it's a nevuah katana? Why would we even call it a nevuah katana? So here are a couple of thoughts in this direction, which I think are important, and it fits very nicely with the whole idea of the articulation and the words that are coming. The Maggid Talumos points out that as a rule, we believe that prophecy that is relevant for posterity has already been given. The last of the prophets is Malachi, and there is no longer going to be relevant prophecy, at least relevant meaning something which is always applicable. And every time and in every place will not be coming back to us until the time of Mashiach. Now it is true that the Rambam speaks about it in Moreh Nevuchim and in Igeres Teman. The Rambam speaks about somebody who lived in his time, whose name was Shmuel, and his father's name was Yehuda, and he speaks about Shmuel, and he says he was Beli Safek and Navi. And the Rambam believed that it's possible that there could be exceptional people that do experience a prophecy of sorts, but their words are not meaningful for others. He could have a prophecy, he could be in communication, could be such a thing, but it's not words of prophecy. Our words of prophecy, the words of our prophets, are preserved for posterity. And as the Gemara Megillah discusses in great detail, I think it's in Daf Yudalad, Daf Tezvav, the Gemara says over there that there were thousands of prophets in antiquity. But we only have this small number of prophets. We only have the 42 male prophets and 7 female prophetesses. These are the words or the prophecies that are relevant for posterity, for every one of us, in every time and in every place. Okay, so the Maggid Talumos says, why is it called a nevuah katana? A nevuah, or nevuah gdoila, really a full mature nevuah, means that you're getting words put into your mouth by Hashem. That's a real nevuah. What's a nevuah katana? That's when words that have already been said, a prophecy that has already been given, is being placed in your mouth. So it's not really that Hashem is speaking through you or to you directly in a way that you're getting an original prophecy. It's that you're getting the words of prophecy that can serve to give you the guidance when you need it. And I'll give you a simple example. You know, people like to purchase cards for loved ones when they have like special, like milestone events, birthday, anniversary. People like to purchase cards, and it's a if it's not $1 billion industry, it's a hundreds of $1 million industry, right? Hallmark cards. It's very, with all the rise of electronic everything, Hallmark is still making money. People still say it with cards. You buy a gift, people like to have a card. You give a bouquet of flowers, box of chocolate, people like to have a card, like to write something. And the Hallmark employs a whole range of very talented writers. And they give you 50 ways of saying, I love you, happy anniversary. And people choose the cards. They spend going, this card, this card, like this is the card. So when somebody who loves you gives you a card like that, does it say something about the relationship? I think the answer is yes. The person chose the card. It says what kind of person it is, because people will choose a certain card. And depending on how many cards they had to choose from, obviously it will be more or less meaningful. And you know, could you predict the kind of card that somebody would choose? Probably you could. Probably, you know, Newtonian determinism would tell you with absolute certainty you could predict it if you know enough about the person. And today with the computer, if you can take the AI and know everything about this person, or at least follow everything this person has X'd and tweeted and posted for the last 10 years, which take AI about 4 split seconds, and then put all the cards in, the AI will tell you that's the card they're going to choose. And they're probably right at least 99 times out of 100. Makes sense. So. And maybe you have to know the relationship. So you have to feed AI a whole bunch of other things. You have to feed AI the kind of things that these people have written about or to each other. And then for sure we'll be able to tell you, so is it meaningful? The answer is yes, it's meaningful. It's meaningful. Is it as meaningful as you sitting down to write your own words? The answer is of course not. Now sometimes when people sit down to write, they're not particularly articulate. So they'll go to, thousands of quotes from whatever, or they'll Google something, or in today's day and age, they'll write it and then they'll send it to AI to fix up. And AI will do a better job of it usually than you, but it's not you. It's not you. So I happened to read this a few weeks ago. I never heard of Taylor Swift. I don't want to hear anything about her. But when Toronto shut down for like 3 days, I was just curious. I said, is there a lesson in Avodas Hashem? Is there something that I should speak about in my sermon on Shabbos? Is something we can learn from this? So I wasted my time on Google a little, just like Googling a few things. I should have been smarter. My wife said, are you kidding? Don't talk about her in a sermon. I said, okay, I should have asked you first. I wasted 20 minutes on Google. But so I came across a few interesting articles. So one of the articles I came across was a fellow who was writing, apparently she's extremely talented at writing lyrics. She's very good at writing lyrics. She works very hard, hard work ethic. And so they fed ideas to AI and said, write me Taylor Swift lyrics. And then it took her original lyrics. And it's almost indistinguishable, but in this article he points out a few things very quickly. He was able to tell apart the AI from the real deal, which I found very interesting. Of course, I could never tell it apart. That's all gibberish to me. But and he says why he found it, and it was interesting to me that there's a difference. AI isn't, I guess, that good yet, so it's still plastic. It's not. Why? Because some of the things in those lyrics are so like off the beaten path. They're so outside the box that even AI can't imagine that. It's like borderline crazy. So you have to actually be that kind of creativity, like that kind of artist, that kind of talent, where you're not even afraid to like live literally beyond the pale, because AI is always going to stay in its lane, because it sets up its lanes. It's always going to stay in the lane. Okay, so just like an interesting. I guess that's the lesson in Avodas Hashem. That's why I had to waste time. There you can learn something from everything. Done. Okay, I can get rid of that now. But my point is that What's the difference between a nevuah gdoila and nevuah ktana? According to the Magid Talmud, there's a very geschmacke difference. A nevuah ktana means you're simply co-opting words of nevuah, but they happen to be meaningful for you right now. But it's not a nevuah. A real nevuah is going to be meaningful for everybody, everywhere, always. And you're not getting something like that, and that's why it's called a nevuah ktana. So I thought that was very interesting. And the Parashas Mordechai says about this whole thing, and I think this is really kind of this like brings it together. He says that there are three interesting kind of checklists over here. Three boxes have to be checked for this to work, for this to be an nevuah ktana. He says, number one, we have to be speaking about a person who woke up in the morning. So I mean that dream. This was like an early morning dream. He woke up with this. So he says he woke up with this. He's not having indigestion. This is not the result of something that he was thinking about or something else that could have caused him to go in a certain direction. Number one. Number two, it had to be a verse that he wasn't talking about or thinking about yesterday. Because if he was talking or thinking about this verse yesterday, then it's natural that this verse is something that would come to mind. He's been thinking about it. It's only the verse that you would not think about that you suddenly find yourself saying. So it has to be what's called, it has to come to him behesach hadas. Not in a choreographed way, not in a way which is predictable, but in a way which is like a surprise. And he said the third thing is that it has to be verbalized. It can't simply come to you. You have to find yourself saying these words. And if that happens, and I want to tell you that the third thing is really the big novelty here. Because oftentimes, like, I don't know, I wake up in the morning sometimes, I have a pasuk. I oftentimes think of a pasuk. I don't know why, but it happens to me very often. I have psukim and I wake up in the morning, I think of a pasuk. But I don't find myself saying the pasuk. That's a big difference. Saying the pasuk, and like I said, it's not even so simple. How would you say the pasuk? You're not even supposed to say the pasuk. But here's, you have to say it. And that fits the cadence of these teachings, because the teachings were about having a dream and verbalizing. And that it would have to come to you out of the blue. You had the dream, you weren't thinking this verse, and it came to you. That's called a nevuah ktana. And I have to say that it's a very, very rare occurrence. Something like this is a very rare occurrence and not common at all. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan teaches it. So it turns out actually this is very much about dreams and very much about holchen achar hapeh, about verbal articulation insofar as interpretation is concerned. So that's dream scenario numero uno. Before we go further, and this is going to be a little bit relevant later on as well, as you'll see. There's a maimer from the Rebbe, which begins with the words lahavin inyan hachalamot, to understand the concept of dreams. It's a rare maimer. The Rebbe spoke, to the best of my recollection, it's only two maimerim from the Rebbe like this. There's a maimer from the Rebbe, Parshas Vayeshev, which was the Shabbos after Yutas Kislev, the Shabbos before Hanukkah, in the year 1963. This is December 1963. And then there was another Yutas Kislev maimer, and if my memory doesn't fail me, it was 1968 or 69. But I didn't look at that recently, so I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm pretty sure the end of the 60s. But there's two times I ever spoke about dreams in a Maimer Chassidus to the best of my recollection. And in this Maimer in 1963, the Rebbe notes that there is a short Maimer from the Alter Rebbe. And the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, very short Maimer, it's in a book called Memorim HaKtzorim, Short Teachings. Over there, the Alter Rebbe talks about the scientific approach to dream analysis, which is something that has fascinated, people who are scientifically inclined, right? But right down to the science of psychiatry. And Freud wrote a book called Dream Interpretation, and many people, other people have written books about dream interpretation. And he says that it's all kind of logical that why people would dream certain things. But the Alter Rebbe says they could never explain how people would dream things that they never thought of, that were never in their mind. So that doesn't have a scientific explanation. That doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. So Freud uses all kinds of mind-bending exercises to come up with how this was actually something you thought of. And he psychoanalyzes his own dreams. So how did I get there? And he's like, it's like a cold domino effect of how it traced back. But, the Alter Rebbe says there are times when nilu hafilusifim. He says the philosophers, which is the way they used to refer to in that time, in the 17th and 18th century, or even earlier, in medieval times, when they referred to the scientific community, they used to call it the philosophical community. So the scientific community doesn't have an answer to that. It doesn't really make sense. It says it doesn't add up. And the Alter Rebbe says, he goes on to say that this is something of it's paranormal, and it can't be rationalized. And he compares it to the concept of something which is transcendent of nature, like a miracle. The mechanics of a miracle. And then the Rebbe notes that there's this mimer from the Rebbe Rashab, which is based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe, and it's a mimer in Tofrei Shayin Ches. I remember very clearly learning this mimer when I gave a class called Kabbalah on Dreams, I don't know, like 25 years ago or something, or 23 years ago. So I remember this mimer very vividly. And the other Yutas Kislev mimer of the Rebbe, by the way, is based on the mimer in Ayin Ches, in the mimer in 1918 that the Rebbe Rashab said, or 1917. But at any rate, the Rebbe notes that this mimer of the Rebbe Rashab is based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe also. And he says that over there, the explanation of Chassidus is, in as many words, your mind generates lots and lots of commands, and your mind has to empty itself. It's like when we used to have computers had to be set to defrag. You remember the defragging the computer? Right, the computer was issuing commands and it would gather up, so you had to empty the computer to cleanse it out. So you have to basically, your head has to go to the washroom basically. You have the leftover pieces of commands that have been the stuff that's stuck in your head, and your mind has to cleanse itself. And over there, that's why he says, that's why a person wakes up in the morning and his mind is fresh. His mind is fresh because it's wiped clean. It's not like he hasn't, all the silly thoughts are out, and that's why he says the best time to think about something is first thing in the morning. That's when you have what they call in Yiddish, a frische Kopf, a fresh head. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe says, how do we explain these two explanations? How do we balance two explanations? They seem to be somewhat contradictory. So the Rebbe says, before we explain the two different explanations or approaches in the teachings of Chassidus, we have to understand the fact that the Gemara makes a statement. We'll probably learn that in our next episode or in 2 episodes from now. That if a person is going to have a dream, he's going to dream what he thought about. And then, on the other hand, we hear about dreams being like prophecy. Like it says in Parshas Ba'aleischa, in Numbers, chapter 10, it talks over there about, chapter 12, pardon me, it's about Moshe Rabbeinu and other prophets, and there would be other prophets in the future. And over there it says, Im yihye neviyachem, if there will be prophets, b'chaloim adaber bay. So Hashem is not happy with Miriam and Aaron for questioning Moshe's level of prophecy. So all other prophets, it comes to them like a dream. It's like a nocturnal vision. Whereas for Moshe Rabbeinu, it's a different kind of prophecy. And the Rebbe points out in the Maimer that it's not only Leikein Avdi Moshe, but in fact, we see this, that by Avraham Avinu, his dream was Tardema Naflo al Avram. By the Bris bin Absara, when he had this prophetic vision, a deep slumber overcame him. And with regard to Yaakov Avinu, father Jacob, it says, Vayachalaim, he fell asleep and he had a dream. And that's when the angels are going up and angels are going down. And when Yaakov Avinu has his prophecy, when he's leaving the land of Israel for the last time alive, and he's in Beersheba, and he's very disturbed by the fact that he's leaving Israel, and Hashem comes to him, he doesn't tell him, don't be disturbed. You should be disturbed. He doesn't say, don't be pained. Of course you should be pained. Leave Eretz Yisrael. But he says, Al tira, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Al tira married the Mitzrayim. Which this is the idea of a nevuah. So how does that work? Well, the Rebbe says an amazing thing. The Rebbe says that when it says that ein maran la'adam, a person doesn't see a dream, it doesn't mean there can't be a dream. It says the Torah is al pi harov tedaber. Most often dreams come from things we saw already. That's most often. Of course there could be a prophecy that's like 1 in a million. That's not a common occurrence. The Gemara, the Torah doesn't talk about the exceptions, it talks about the rule. The rule is you only see a dream from whatever you thought of already. So the Rebbe says, with regard to prophecy, we have a statement that our sages make. It's found in the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin on page 89. And the Gemara says that Ein shnei neviim misnavim b'signan echad. Two prophets never speak in the same syntax. Every prophet has his own style of speaking, which of course lead the Bible critics to say that the Bible is written by multiple authors, and because there's different prophets, and every prophet speaks differently. And the Rebbe asks, why does every prophet speak differently? Isn't it Hashem's word? If it's Hashem's word and the prophet is simply a funnel, then the prophet should have no influence on how the prophecy comes across. And the Rebbe says that the answer to that question is that the prophecy has to be, and I'm using the language of Chassidus now, mitlabesh bekelim shel hanavi. It has to assume the persona of the prophet. The prophet has to absorb the prophecy. And then when the prophet absorbs the prophecy, he is going to relay the prophecy in its purity, but as he absorbed it. Now the absorption doesn't chas v'shalom change the content. But when the Navi is going to give from the prophecy, he's going to give you the prophecy in the way that he speaks, or she speaks. And the Rebbe says that this is similar to something which is talked about in many Maimarim of Chassidus. The previous Rebbe speaks about this in multiple Maimarim, that sometimes you have the same halacha in the Rif, and in the Rosh, and in the Ran. There were three different people. They lived in different places, in slightly different times, and they say the exact same thing, but the nuanced differences are in syntax, how they verbalize it, and they're not repeating each other. Sometimes they didn't see what the other wrote, but that's because we say oisies, that letters, that method of verbalization comes from a very deep place. It comes from etzem hanefesh. And the Rebbe goes on to explain that even when a dream can have meaning, when it's not a real prophecy, so it's going to utilize the mechanism of something that the person was already thinking about. It doesn't come to him with new words. It's words that exist already. This is similar to the teaching of the Magid Talumis. The Magid Talumis says the prophecy is simply coming in words of previous prophecies, but that's the interpretation. The Rebbe now is speaking about the dream side. So unless you're like a real prophet, and none of us are, you're not going to get words which you never thought of before, or ideas you never thought of before. It's going to come to you in the syntax of what you already thought about. Because the vast, overwhelming majority, 99.99999 of people who have dreams, even meaningful dreams, not the demonic dreams you talked about, even through an angel, but nonetheless it's going to co-opt your words. It's going to use your words. It's going to use your thoughts. It's going to use your symbols. It's going to use your thought process to simply build on that to convey the message. So you will have a dream coming from higher consciousness, but it will come through your consciousness. And when you see it that way, this really explains the concept of nevuah and nevuah ktana. That's the meaning of a minor prophecy, because that real prophecy doesn't utilize anything, doesn't utilize any preconceived reality. A real prophecy is coming from a higher place. This is a nevuah ktana. It's a minor prophecy. It's prophecy-like. It's not prophecy, it's intuition. It's prophetic-like. Michal David is mentioning on the chat something which I pointed out. This is just my observation, by the way. Michal David is mentioning it. I happen to believe it's true, that there's a lot of similarities between the Rebbe's father's Torah and the Ben Ish Chai. I find many similarities in the way he interprets Gemara, and the way the Ben Ish Chai does. They've never met each other. They live in different places. They lived around the same time. Ben Ish Chai passed on just after the Rebbe was born, but very similar to the Rebbe's father's style. And so, this is a Torah that came into the atmosphere at the same time, and they had a syntax. And sometimes they could say almost the same thing, but in a slightly different, the content is similar, the syntax will be different. But I could be wrong about that. That's just my own personal observation. Okay, so that is, my friends, the first piece of Gemara. It's clear? Does it make sense? Yes? To me, this Gemara, now the Gemara makes sense. Before, we learned the Gemara before, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why is the Gemara interjecting with a pasuk that hits you? What does it even mean? But now it makes perfect sense. And that leads us into the next piece of Gemara, which is another teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. Ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan, shalosh chaloimos miskaimin. There are three kinds of dreams mean 3 dream scenarios, and these dream scenarios are going to happen. And some want to suggest, even if there's no interpretation, because these dreams are so profound, it's so clear that you should know that without an interpretation also. What are they? The first, he says, is Chalom Shel Shacharit, the dreams of the morning. The dreams of the morning. When are dreams of the morning? So, the Maharsha has lots to say about this. The Maharsha says that Chalom Shel Shacharit means the dreams that come right before a person wakes up. And he says like this. He says, the very similar to the ideas talked about in Chassidus of the mind washing itself and cleansing itself and getting rid of the old commands. He says all of that happens in the beginning of the night. By the time you reach morning, your mind's already been emptied. You slept already. It's not just about your thoughts in general. Your mind gets rid of all kinds of extraneous things. Your body gets rid of extraneous things when you sleep, and you sweat it out. And that's why people oftentimes are not pleasant smelling in the morning. Why? Because your body's been pushing all these toxins, and the toxins stink. Your body gets it off, and that's why people take a shower in the morning, to rinse it off. So your body rebuilds itself. The cells replace themselves, and then toxins absorbed during the course of the day get pushed out of the body so that a person should be healthy. Otherwise, if a person doesn't sleep, he continues, there's a buildup of like poisons in the body, and eventually that will kill the person. Part of the reason that a person will die if he doesn't sleep after a certain amount of time is because if the body doesn't have a chance to replenish itself and to push out the toxins, it's going to overwhelm him. A person will literally be poisoned, just like a person who, God forbid, doesn't use the washroom. You've got to get rid of those toxins. No intake, no toxins. You also die of starvation. There's no way out. You have to eat, but it's full of poison. That's the nature of things. So whatever you eat is going to kill you over time, but if you don't eat, you'll die a lot faster. Okay, but the same thing is true, like being in any particular environment, there's always things we're absorbing constantly. The body absorbs things, or the body produces waste, and the body has to get rid of that. He said all that happens during the first few intense hours of sleep. So by the time you get to the morning, he says, now all of a sudden, the things that you're coming to mind, these things are most meaningful. They can't simply be a rehash, getting rid of or pushing out the negative things. You may be rehashing some old ideas, he says, but the rehashing of that old idea is coming back to you now because something deeper is being conveyed to you. And the Maharsha also says that this, when we say that it's miskaimen, we talked about before that any dream could be interpreted. He said, but if you have this dream right before you wake up in the morning, then it doesn't even need interpretation. That's the chiddush, that's the novelty of Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan's first teaching is that when you interpret it yourself, you need no longer interpretation. And his second novelty is, the second teaching is, and this is the other 3 dream scenarios, the first dream scenario is that the words come to you, the interpretation comes to you in the form of words of scripture. And the second interpretation is, or the second set of dream scenarios is, the first one is that early morning dream. And that's why it doesn't require any interpretation afterwards. Or as the Sifsei Chachamim says, that in the middle of the night, he's simply being shown on his in his imagination the things that he thought of during the day. But Samach l'Shachrish, he says, you already saw the movie. You've been through all this already. So he says at this point, then it must be real. Must be real. And we go further in the Gemara now. The Gemara says the second thing is chaloim shechalom loy chaverei, a dream that's a message for you, but somebody else dreamed it. So it can't be what somebody else was thinking because it was a dream for you. It's meaningful for you, and that could be a very meaningful thing. And finally, chaloim sheniftar b'toich chaloim. You have a dream, and along with the dream, you have an interpretation. The interpretation is part of the dream. When the interpretation is part of the dream, then it doesn't need to be interpreted. And here, the chiddush, the novelty here is, before we said, the first Gemara, the first scenario was, it still requires verbalization. It's a different kind of verbalization. It's a certain verbalization because it comes through you, through your own, it falls into your own mouth, and you find yourself mindlessly repeating words of prophecy. The second piece, the second 3 dream scenarios require no interpretation. Not even your own. It's not even you don't have to verbalize anything. Because the nature of something that you dream right as you're waking up, that for sure has some kind of meaning for you. And therefore, if somebody else is going to dream, so it can't simply be what your mind is cleansing itself because it's in the morning already. Or somebody else is having the dream for you. They can't have your thoughts. They can't be stuck with your extraneous things. And lastly, if you're having that interpretation as well. So the Sif Secham says it's the same idea with all three. Why? It's the same reason that if somebody else is dreaming. Or chalaim the shenifter, then he says, talks about chalaim shenishna, which is the next scenario in the Gemara. And he quotes this in the name of the Smichas Chachamim, who was a great sage who lived a century prior, one of the great Talmudic teachers. I'm probably crazy for telling this to you, but I had a very strange dream this week about somebody else who I'd never spoken to before. It's a distant relative of mine, much older than me. I know of this person. He's like a well-known person, but I never spoke to him. And I had a certain dream that he requires to be taken care of in a certain way, and that otherwise he could be in danger. And I was like, it was very disturbing. I don't know what to do with it. And it turns out that I know somebody's very close to him, but I also haven't spoken to him in many years. But he's closer to me in age, but I know him. So a member of his family. So I made sent a couple of text messages till I got that person's number. Lives in a distant place. And I called up this fellow, who I haven't spoken to in years, and I identified myself. And he said, oh, wow, so nice to hear from you. What can I do for you? And I said, look, I had a very strange dream this morning, and it involves this person, this relative of yours. And I don't know what to say. I don't think about this person. I don't even know this person. I never spoke to him. I've never spoken to him a word in my life, even though we're distantly related. So, and this younger person who I'm telling it to is like, you have no idea, he tells me. You have no idea, this just cleared something up. Okay, I know what we have to do now. Thank you very much for making the call. So the Eibishter needed to send him a message. Why he chose me, I have no idea. But I'm not, I can't make these things up. Like, I'm purposely leaving out all the details because nobody's business. It's like, but I know this is online and it takes a life of itself. Okay, but I'm just saying that's what the Gemara, when you dream about somebody for somebody else, the message could have a meaning for them, and there could be something there.
So did the pasuk fall into your mind?
No, there was no pasuk. I said a lot of times pasukim come to me, but funny pasukim that I don't think I'm thinking, but I never say it. How could I just watch Negavas? I never said it, so it doesn't mean anything. But this is like here the last three dream scenarios don't require verbalization. That's the chiddush here. These three don't require verbalization. These three are like, they're meaningful without interpretation as well, and that's the chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan. So it turns out like this, and to make this just to kind of wrap it up. Rabbi Yochanan is building on what we learned before. What did we learn before? The teaching of Rav Bano, which is the importance of dream interpretation. So Rabbi Yochanan comes and he says, and there's another kind of dream interpretation that doesn't make a difference if somebody else says otherwise. It's even more solid, an articulated dream interpretation. When is that? When it comes to you in the form of a verse that you end up articulating when you're rising. And then the other three scenarios don't even require interpretation. They don't even require any kind of articulation in order to actualize them, because they're so real that inevitably something is going to come of them regardless. So that, my dear friends, is our class on dream scenarios. And hopefully that was informative, a little uplifting. And as I say, whenever we finish a class on dreams, I hope the nightmare that we're living now comes to an end very, very soon. And that the thing we're all dreaming of, our dreams, the dream of redemption and the dream of universal happiness and God consciousness, will hopefully soon come upon us with the coming of Mashiach. And then we'll say, Hayinu kecholman. That was one long nightmare, the whole galus. Anyway, it should be b'mheida, it will be ameinu speedily, and in our days, amen. If you're joining us for the first time, shalom. Welcome aboard. If you're not subscribed, please do so. If you are, please share it with family and friends. And if everybody would be so kind as to share these links and these teachings, we can continue to promulgate messages of Torah and God consciousness, and hopefully inspiration. Yasher koyach, Laila Tov. I look forward to seeing you back soon.